Alright, welcome everyone. This is Stat 1020 at Wayne State University. Our first chapter will be, where do data come from? Now when you watch these videos, I'd like you to them just as you would any other classroom lecture, so be sure to take detailed notes. If at any point there is something that is unclear to you during the lecture, please make note of it so we can discuss it at our next class meeting. I'll also occasionally ask you to answer some questions on your own, so when prompted to do so, pause the video, record the question, record your answer, and then unpause the video to check your response. The first part of this course is concerned with collecting and classifying data. As you will quickly learn, there is a large amount of vocabulary in part 1 of this course. It is expected that you know all these terms, so be sure to record and understand each new term that appears throughout the semester. The terms and concepts that we will discuss in Chapter 1 are individuals and variables, observational studies, sample surveys, populations and samples, census, and experiments. Now you may already have a sense of what these terms mean, but we will give formal definitions for each of them in the slides that follow. So first of all, what is statistics? Informally, statistics is the science of learning from data. Now this definition is quite vague, and it's not particularly important for the time being. However, by the end of the course you should be able to give your own definition about what statistics actually is. So let's move to the first two important terms in our course, individuals and variables. Now individuals are the objects described by a data set. Individuals can be people, animals, or even objects. Simply put, individuals are the objects we want to study. Now a variable, or variables, are the characteristics or traits of an individual that we would like to study. In general, variables can take a variety of values, and the value of a variable depends on the individual. Let's look at an example. Consider the 5 students, Surah, David, Annette, Sun, and Maria. Here we are considering 5 individuals, and in this case, the individuals are people. Now for each individual, we are going to consider 3 traits or characteristics. These are the variables. In this case, the first variable is their major, the second one is the number of points they earned in a course, and the third variable is their letter grade. Notice how the value of the variable is dependent on the individual. So let's take a look at our first method for collecting data, called an observational study. So let's begin with the definition. An observational study observes individuals and measures variables of interest, but does not attempt to influence the responses of the individuals. Now, anytime data is collected, there are 2 parties involved. The first party is the researcher. This is the person who collects the data. The second party are the individuals themselves. These are the objects that produce the data. Now, what distinguishes an observational study from other means of collecting data is the role of the researcher. Now, in an observational study, the researcher plays a passive role. He or she is there simply to collect the responses of each individual. The researcher in no way attempts to influence the responses of the individual. He or she is simply there to record what is observed. Now, the purpose of an observational study is to describe some group or situation. For an example, let's recall the responses of the 5 students from the previous example. The student's instructor may have collected that data to get a sense of what the average course grade was, or perhaps even compare the major and final letter grade of each student to investigate whether or not there is a connection between a student's major and their final course grade. So let's look at one of the most fundamental concepts of statistics, that of sampling. The idea of sampling is to gain information about the whole by examining only part. Here there are 2 relevant definitions. populations, and samples. The population is the entire group of individuals about which we want information. So some examples could include adult Americans, the voting population, and college students. Now, due mainly to practicality concerns, it's typically unfeasible to gain information about the entire population. And this is where a sample comes into play. A sample is a part of the population from which we actually collect information. Our goal is to use the information in the sample to try and draw conclusions about the entire population. The figure below gives a good model of what statistics is actually all about. So we start with some population about which we want information. From the population, a sample is chosen that is representative of the population and data is collected. Finally, by analyzing the data, one makes an inference or conclusion about the population as a whole. If you've ever heard the terms inductive and deductive reasoning, then this suggests that statistics is a form of inductive reasoning. In other words, we are using examples, in the form of samples in this case, to draw general conclusions, in this case describing a population. Let's look at an example. Polls such as those conducted by Gallup and many news organizations ask people's opinions on a variety of issues. The variables measured are responses to questions about public issues. Though most noticed at election time, these polls are conducted on a regular basis throughout the year. So let's take a look at what a typical opinion poll might look like. So first of all, what is the population? In other words, what is the relevant group of individuals about which we want information? Now, there technically could be more than one answer to this question. However, for our purposes, we'll let the population be U.S. residents 18 years of age and over. We'll include non-citizens and illegal immigrants as well. So essentially, the voting population. Now, to try and make an inference about this population, between 1,000 and 1,500 people will be interviewed via telephone. This is where the data will come from which we will try and make an inference about the population as a whole. Now you try one. The CNN Opinion Research Corporation conducted a poll on September 1st and 2nd, 2010. They asked the following question. Do you think the government should or should not fund research that would use newly created stem cells obtained from human embryos? The CNN Opinion Research Poll reported that the poll consisted of telephone interviews with 1,024 randomly selected adult Americans. What do you think the population is? And what is the sample? So pause the video and unpause when you're ready for the answer. In this case, the population would be all adult Americans, and the sample would be the 1,024 that were randomly selected. Like said previously, a sample is typically taken because it's impractical to sample the entire population. Although it won't play a very large role in our course, there are times when we would like to do this. This is called a census. A census is a sample survey that attempts to include the entire population in the sample. Recall, in an observational study, the researcher collects data in such a way so as not to influence the responses of the individuals. An experiment, on the other hand, is in direct contrast to this. An experiment deliberately imposes some treatment on individuals to measure their responses. The purpose is to study whether the treatment causes a change in the response. As an example, suppose a researcher wants to investigate the effect of physical therapy on the range of motion of those who had recently undergone knee surgery. In this case, the researcher would measure the range of motion of the patients before physical therapy, then would apply the treatment, which in this case is physical therapy, and then finally measure the range of motion of the patients after treatment to see whether or not there was a change. Now you try one. To determine what students found most helpful, an educational researcher examined student comments from several classes he taught. Mentioned most often was the fact that copies of lectures were posted on the class website for students to download. The researcher recommended that instructors post lecture notes on their course websites. Was this an observational study or an experiment? So pause the video and unpause when you're ready for the answer. This was an observational study. So in closing, let's briefly review what we discussed today. So individuals are the objects that we want to study, and variables are the characteristic of these individuals that we want to study. Observational studies were our first means of collecting data. An observational study collects data in such a way so as not to influence the responses of the individuals. A sample survey is where data is collected from a subset of the population, called a sample, to make inferences about the population as a whole. A census is a sample survey that includes the entire population, not just a sample. And then finally, the purpose of an experiment is to measure whether or not a treatment changes the responses in individuals.